Ancient statues were living libraries, their silent forms guarding the secrets of forgotten gods. This video uncovers the profound mystery of why ancient cultures locked their most vital stories inside these stone and metal figures. We are going on a journey across Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Mesoamerica to see how statues served as divine vessels, cosmic maps, and memory palaces. You will learn to see ancient art not as simple decoration, but as a charged interface between humanity and the divine. We will reveal the hidden language of symbols, the rituals that could breathe life into stone, and why this incredible knowledge was ultimately lost. How did a simple carving become a home for a god, and what happened when that presence was stolen away? By the end, you will understand the epic battle our ancestors waged against Oblivion itself. What forgotten story do you think is waiting to be unlocked from the silence of stone? A hushed chant echoes in a lamplit chamber. A priest's chisel, not of stone but of ritual, gently touches the mouth of a freshly carved statue. With this sacred act, the opening of the mouth, the ancient Egyptians believed they were not merely blessing an object, they were performing a spiritual vivisection, breathing a soul into inert matter. To their eyes, the statue was now a living body, a necessary vessel for a god who required a physical form to interact with the human world. This was not symbolic art. It was divine technology. The god's presence in its statue was what maintained Mot, the fundamental order of the cosmos. Without this anchor, chaos seeped back into creation. The statue became a fixed point, a sacred intersection where heaven touched earth. This desperate need to house the divine explains the obsessive care, the priceless materials, and the profound secrecy surrounding their creation. Why would an entire civilization pour its greatest wealth and finest skill into a single figure? Because they believed the survival of their world, the turning of the seasons, and the flow of the Nile itself depended on that stone body remaining inhabited. This belief in a statue's living presence forces us to look closer, to ask what secret ingredients beyond ritual could make stone seem alive. That specific vein of rose granite was not chosen by chance. To the Egyptian artisans, the very stone from the quarry pulsed with a latent power, a resonance that aligned with the sun god Ra himself. This was the foundational principle of sacred art, a spiritual alchemy where the material was the first and most crucial ingredient in the story. Before a sculptor ever raised a tool, the statue's narrative was being written in its substance. Gold was not merely valuable, it was considered the flesh of the gods, an incorruptible metal that mirrored their eternal nature. Lapis lazuli, imported from far distant Afghanistan, was not just a blue stone, it was a piece of the starry night sky, a sliver of the cosmic ocean from which the gods emerged. The deep black of ebony represented the fertile, life-giving soil of the Nile floodplain, the foundation of all civilization. Each material carried a coded meaning, a layer of the cosmic story waiting to be unlocked. This belief extended far beyond Egypt. In Mesopotamia, rulers commissioned their portraits from a rare, incredibly hard stone called diorite, which had to be laboriously imported from the distant Oman region. Why go to such immense trouble? Because diorite itself was seen as numinous, a substance inherently capable of containing and amplifying the immense presence of a deity or a king. The stone was not a passive block waiting to be shaped. It was an active participant in the divine manifestation, a partner in the sacred act of creation. The artist's role, then, was not to impose a form upon an inert material, but to collaborate with it, to reveal the divine story already sleeping within the stone. But choosing the right material was only the beginning. The true magic, the act of awakening that sleeping story, lay in the sculptor's hands and the secret language of symbols they wielded. The sculptor's chisel did more than carve a shape, it inscribed a hidden language. Every line and curve was a deliberate choice, a symbol that told the god's story and defined its power. The horns on a helmet were not decorative, they were the unmistakable mark of a deity's divine status. A shepherd's crook was not a prop, it was a declaration of the god's role as the guide and protector of the people. This symbolic vocabulary was a map of divine attributes, a way to compress an entire cosmic biography into a single, silent form. But a map is useless without a destination. The final, breathtaking transformation from a beautifully carved object to a living, breathing vessel required one last essential key, a ritual of pure magic. Inside the inner sanctum of a Sumerian temple, a profound silence would fall. The air, thick with incense, hummed with anticipation. The high priest stood before the newly finished statue, his hands steady. He began the ancient ritual known as the washing of the mouth. This was not a simple cleansing. It was a theological operation, a sequence of precise actions designed to grant the statue the five senses. With sacred water and special oils, the statue's mouth was purified, enabling it to consume offerings. Its eyes were anointed, allowing it to see the world and the devotion of its worshippers. The statue was then dressed in lavish garments and presented with a meal. This was not a symbolic gesture. The community believed the god now physically inhabited the statue, that it truly ate the food and drank the water placed before it. The idol had become a theophany, a genuine appearance of the divine in the human world. The story locked within the stone was no longer a dormant legend, it was an active, conscious presence. This living statue now served as the very heart of the community, a fixed point where heaven and earth met, where human fears and hopes could be delivered directly to a listening ear. At the center of Athens, a city of thinkers and warriors, stood a figure of wood, gold, and ivory so immense it seemed to hold up the very sky. The cult statue of Athena Parthenos was not merely a representation of the city's patron goddess, it was the city's beating heart. Her towering presence in the Parthenon was a cosmic anchor, a divine guarantee that the goddess herself was physically present, her favor ensuring the city's order and prosperity. To lose this statue was to risk everything, for its safety was inseparable from the safety of Athens itself. Every major political decision, every solemn oath sworn by its leaders, was made under her unwavering gaze. The Great Panathenaic Festival, a city-wide procession that culminated in presenting a new robe to the statue, was not a simple celebration. It was a ritual recharge, a communal act of storytelling that reaffirmed the bond between the people and their divine protector. The stories physically locked into her form, from the serpents on her shield representing the defeat of chaos to the birth of Pandora carved into its base, were not mere decorations. They were the foundational charter of Athenian identity, the divine justification for their laws, their values, and their very right to exist. This colossal figure was the ultimate bulwark against the chaos of a godless world and the forgetfulness of a people without a past. But how could such a vital, living presence be protected from the greatest threat of all, the slow decay of time and the eventual collapse of the civilization that worshipped it? The ancients developed a brilliant, if heartbreaking, solution. They built memory palaces not of stone but of pure information. The crook and flail held by an Egyptian pharaoh tell a story without a single written word. These were not just ceremonial tools, they were a compact declaration of royal duty. The crook was the shepherd's staff, a clear symbol of the king's role as the guide and protector of his human flock. The flail was the instrument used to thresh wheat, directly linking the pharaoh's power to the fertility of the land and the abundance of the harvest. This was a visual language where every single element was a deliberate choice, a word in a silent, sacred sentence. The style of a royal wig, the specific shape of a double crown uniting two lands, even the animals crouched at a god's feet, all of it was dense with meaning. A jackal might signify guardianship of the dead, while a lion represented raw, untamed power. This symbolic code was how ancient cultures encoded their most profound knowledge directly into the art itself. A single statue could function as a three-dimensional book, its form containing layers of theological concepts, historical records, and maps of the cosmos. The deeper your understanding of the symbols, the more of the story you could unlock. This system was a brilliant form of intellectual insurance. It ensured that even if the papyrus scrolls crumbled to dust or the oral chants fell silent, the core truths of the culture would remain, permanently etched into the most durable materials they could find. This encoded knowledge, however, was not meant to be a secret kept from everyone. It was a mystery meant to be solved, a story waiting for the right person to read it. And that task fell to a very specific group of individuals, the guardians of this esoteric understanding. The high priest moved in a silence broken only by the whisper of his own robes. In the sacred darkness of the inner sanctum, he alone was permitted to approach the god, to wash its stone body, dress it in linen, and present its daily meal. This was not a chore, it was the highest privilege and the heaviest responsibility. The priesthood were far more than just temple attendants. They were the living guardians of the esoteric keys. For years, sometimes decades, they were trained in a secret curriculum, learning to read the complex symbolic language carved into every statue. They memorized the precise gestures and incantations of the mouth-opening ritual, the only ceremony believed capable of breathing a soul into the stone. This knowledge was a sacred trust, passed carefully from master to initiate in closed, private ceremonies. Its secrecy was not about hoarding power, but about protecting it from dilution, from careless handling that could break the fragile connection between the human and divine worlds. The priest was the essential interpreter, the only one who could fully unlock the statue's narrative and translate its cosmic meaning for the community. During a public festival, he might explain the symbols on the god's crown, making the story accessible to the farmer and the scribe alike. When the pharaoh sought guidance, the priest would interpret the god's will, perhaps through the way light fell on the statue's face or through a dream inspired by its presence. This exclusive role created a powerful and sometimes tense dynamic. The public experienced the divine through awe and ritual, but the priesthood held the technical knowledge that made the entire system work. They maintained the vessel, ensuring the divine presence remained strong, and the stories encoded in the art never lost their power. This delicate balance between elite knowledge and public faith would ultimately determine the fate of these living symbols when their civilizations faced their greatest tests. But this sacred knowledge, held so tightly by the priesthood, was useless if the entire community could not connect with it. For the average person, the story had to be unforgettable. Before the age of books, memory itself was the library, and statues were its most resilient shelves. How could a culture recall its epic tales, its complex genealogies, and its sacred laws across countless generations? The answer was carved in stone for all to see. A bard standing before the carved metopes of a Greek temple would not just see decorative scenes, he would see his entire set list laid out in stone. The image of Heracles struggling with the Nemean lion was his cue to launch into the full, poetic account of the first labor. The depiction of a Trojan warrior was his trigger to recite entire chapters from the Iliad. The statue, or the carved frieze, served as a physical anchor for a memory that lived in breath and rhythm. It was a durable reference point in a world of fleeting speech, a fail-safe against the forgetfulness that threatened to erase a people's identity. This transformed the entire temple complex into a memory palace on a grand, public scale. Every column, every sculpted pediment, every painted statue held a precise piece of the cultural narrative. The stories were not merely illustrated on the architecture, they were locked into it, their sequence and details preserved in the unchanging order of stone. This mnemonic genius ensured that the epic of a hero or the lore of a king could be accurately transmitted without a single written word from a grandfather to a grandson, simply by walking through a sacred space and remembering the tales each figure told. The statue was no longer just a home for a god, it was a living bookmark in the story of a people. A Roman emperor, immortalized in gleaming white marble, often wore a face that was not his own. It was the stern brow of Jupiter, the father of the gods, or the powerful, lion-skinned, draped visage of Hercules. This was not simple flattery. It was a profound act of political storytelling, locking a narrative of divine right and heroic destiny directly into the ruler's public image. The statue became a declaration, telling the people a story not of the man's mundane reality, but of the mythic archetype he claimed to embody. He was not merely a leader, he was a savior, a conqueror, a god walking among mortals. This artistic strategy deliberately blurred the line between verifiable history and powerful myth. The distinction was irrelevant to the statue's purpose, which was to project an ideological truth so powerful it became reality. Across the Mediterranean, the same principle held true for the pharaohs of Egypt. Their statues, carved from the hardest granite, showed them in a perpetual state of triumph, forever crushing foreign enemies beneath their feet. This was not a record of a single battle, but a standardized, endlessly repeated story of victory. It declared that the pharaoh was the sole guardian of Mot, the fundamental order of the cosmos, and that through his eternal strength, chaos was held at bay. These statues were not considered lies in the modern sense. They were assertions of a deeper, more vital truth, a cosmic reality that the ruler was duty-bound to manifest. The statue, therefore, became the official and unchangeable record. It froze a single, perfect narrative in time, etching a version of events into the most permanent material available, a version meant to outlast papyrus, outlast memory, and stand for eternity as the only story that truly mattered. The colossal Sphinx does not merely rest upon the sand. Its stone gaze is locked precisely on the point where the sun rises on the spring equinox, a direct and silent conversation with the cosmos itself. This was no accident of placement. The location and celestial alignment of a statue were as much a part of its story as the symbols carved upon its surface. Where a statue stood determined the very nature of its power. A fierce figure at a city gate was not just a symbol of protection, it was a functional guardian, its story one of warding off malevolent forces. A serene statue sealed within a tomb served as a guide for the soul, its narrative a map through the terrifying landscape of the afterlife, and the cult statue in the deepest, darkest chamber of a temple, accessible only to the high priest, was not merely representing a god, it was a direct conduit, a sacred telephone line to the divine. The story it held was activated and amplified by its specific, consecrated location. This principle transforms our understanding of these ancient figures. They were not solitary works of art, but vital nodes in a vast, invisible network. In Mesoamerica, the massive Olmec heads were not dropped randomly in the jungle. They were carefully positioned in relation to sacred mountains and life-giving rivers, embedding their powerful, enigmatic presence into a living environmental story. Their meaning was inseparable from the land itself. This sacred geography extended into the realm of pure magic. In rituals found from Rome to Egypt, small statues, sometimes called puppets, were not just carved to resemble a person. To activate their power, they were deliberately hidden in specific, charged locations, buried at a crossroads or sealed within the walls of a home. The statue's story of love, vengeance, or protection was only unlocked when it was physically connected to a place of potent energy. This reveals the final, profound layer of the ancient logic. A statue was never truly alone. Its locked story remained dormant until it was plugged into the sacred grid of the world, a network of earth, sky, and spirit. Buried beneath the floorboards of a Mesopotamian home, a small clay figure stood guard. This was an Apkallu, a wise, fish-cloaked spirit, and its silent vigil was a matter of life and death. These figurines were not art for display. They were functional devices in a world teeming with invisible threats. Demons of disease and misfortune were a constant danger, and the story locked inside these statues was one of unceasing protection. Their very form, often inscribed with potent incantations, was a permanent shield, a magical circuit breaker installed in the very foundations of a building to ward off spiritual decay. This was applied supernatural technology, where the statue served as a physical anchor for a spell meant to operate in perpetuity. The same principle transformed medicine in ancient Egypt. A healing statue, its surface covered from head to toe in intricate hieroglyphs, would have sacred water poured over it. The water did not simply wash the stone. It was believed to absorb the power of the magical texts, becoming a potent, ingestible cure. The statue itself was a battery, its form and inscriptions concentrating supernatural energy into a specific, tangible effect. You could literally drink the story it held. This practical magic reveals a worldview with no clean separation between matter and spirit. A statue was not a representation of power. It was a container for it, a carefully crafted tool that could defend a home, cure an illness, or channel a god's will. The locked stories were not just for remembering, they were for using. But what happens when the people who knew how to read these stories, who knew the rituals to charge these batteries, finally vanish? An Egyptian pharaoh stands with his left foot forward, his arms locked rigidly at his sides, his gaze fixed on a timeless horizon. This posture is not a limitation of the sculptor's skill, it is the entire point. The rigid, forward-facing stance of Old Kingdom statuary was a direct statement of unchanging power and eternal stability. It communicated a ruler who was an unmoving pillar of the cosmos, a fixed point against the chaos of entropy. Now shift your gaze to a classical Greek statue of a young athlete. His weight rests casually on one leg, his hips tilted in a graceful curve, his body captured in a moment of potential motion. This is Contrapposto, and its relaxed humanistic posture tells a completely different story, one of idealized human potential, of beauty found in balance and movement. The very way a statue held itself was a loaded, deliberate element of its narrative, a silent vocabulary understood by every member of the culture. A single hand raised with the palm outward was not a simple wave. It was the universal gesture of blessing and protection, a divine promise carved into flesh like stone. A finger held to lips commanded a sacred silence, signaling the presence of a mystery too profound for words. In Buddhist art, the specific positioning of the hands and fingers, known as mudras, formed an entire theological dictionary. The story of a compassionate, teaching Buddha was told through the gentle, open-palmed gesture of reassurance, while the narrative of a wrathful deity, a protector of the faith, was conveyed through a dynamic, aggressive stance, often brandishing symbolic weapons. This bodily language allowed the statue to speak directly to the devotee, communicating the deity's nature, its relationship to humanity, and its specific role in the vast cosmic scheme. Decoding this silent language is essential, for it often reveals a deeper, more pragmatic layer to the story, one designed to reinforce the established political and social order. A king depicted in the serene, cross-legged posture of a Buddha was not just making a religious statement. he was visually claiming the spiritual authority and enlightened wisdom of a universal monarch. The story locked in the stone was not merely a myth, it was a tool of statecraft, a permanent argument for the legitimacy of the one who ruled. The colossal faces of Ramses II stare eternally across the Nile, their monumental scale a deliberate act of intimidation. These temples at Abu Simbel were not built for a local audience. They were carved directly into the cliff face on Egypt's southern border, a permanent, unmissable billboard for any Nubian trader or chieftain sailing down the river. The story these four-seated giants told was not subtle. It was a narrative of absolute power, a declaration that the pharaoh's gaze reached even here, into the very rock of the conquered land. His authority was as immovable as the mountain itself. This was statecraft in stone. Across the ancient world, the physical presence of the ruler was a primary tool of control. In the vast Persian Empire, where communication across thousands of miles was painfully slow, how could the great king make his will felt in every province? His solution was both simple and brilliant. Imperial messengers did not travel with just scrolls and seals. They carried small, finely crafted statues of the emperor himself. When this effigy arrived in a distant satrapy, it was not merely a symbol. In the eyes of the local governors and populace, the emperor's authority was physically present in that object. To obey the message was to obey the man whose likeness stood before them. The story locked in this portable statue was one of seamless, omnipresent control, a political reality compressed into a handheld figure. The ultimate expression of this power was the deliberate fusion of the king with the divine. A Roman emperor was often sculpted with the perfectly idealized features of Apollo, or his head was placed upon the muscular, heroic body of Jupiter. This was more than flattery, it was a theological claim made visible. The ruler was not just favored by the gods, he shared in their essential nature. His commands were not merely human law, they were an extension of cosmic order. To question his authority was to rebel against the very structure of the universe. These statues were the propaganda engines of the ancient world, broadcasting a single, non-negotiable story to both citizen and enemy alike. Look upon this face, they commanded. See the unyielding strength, the divine favor, the destiny written in marble and bronze. Your loyalty is the only rational response, and your defiance is utterly futile. This narrative of invincibility was the glue that held sprawling, multi-ethnic empires together. But what happens to the story when the empire falls, when the ruler depicted is overthrown, and the god he claimed to embody is forgotten by a new world? The empty stone bases in the Roman Forum stand as silent tombstones for the stories they once held. These weathered plinths once supported gleaming bronze figures of emperors and senators, their forms telling the epic of Rome's rise. But the metal was too valuable, their meanings too tied to a fallen order. They were pulled down, melted in fires, and recast as coins, cannonballs, or the nails for a new cathedral. The very permanence the sculptors sought was a beautiful, tragic illusion. Stone itself, for all its endurance, is vulnerable to the slow, patient violence of wind and water, its carved details softening into vague shapes over centuries. Yet the greater danger always came from human hands. When a new faith rose to power, the old gods had to be silenced. With the official adoption of Christianity, the magnificent cult statues of Jupiter and Venus were not simply discarded as outdated art. They were seen as vessels housing dangerous, demonic spirits. Mobs and zealous authorities would deliberately strike off a statue's nose, gouge out its eyes, or break its hand. This was not random vandalism. It was a deliberate act of spiritual murder, a ritualized killing meant to deactivate the divine presence and erase the power of the story locked within. The medium chosen for its eternal durability became the primary target for anyone wishing to rewrite history. The survival of a statue and its encoded narrative was a fragile lottery. its fate tied entirely to the survival of the civilization that knew how to read it. This is the ultimate irony of their grand project, a battle against oblivion fought with materials that could be smashed, melted, or simply forgotten. The hacked face of a pharaoh stares out from a broken slab of stone. This is the work of Iconoclasm, the calculated murder of an image, and it is the ultimate testament to the power these statues were believed to hold. When the pharaoh Akhenaten died, his revolutionary religion died with him, and the reaction was swift and brutal. His statues were systematically sought out and mutilated. Their faces were smashed, their names chiseled away from every inscription. This was not random violence or the simple rage of a mob. It was a precise, state-sanctioned operation. The attackers targeted the statue's senses with chilling purpose. They broke its nose so it could no longer breathe the sacred air. They shattered its mouth so it could no longer speak its divine will or consume offerings. They gouged out its eyes, blinding it to the world of the living. This was a spiritual execution. The perpetrators believed they were not just destroying stone, they were dismantling a living vessel, deactivating its power, and silencing the dangerous story it contained forever. This ancient logic echoes tragically into the modern day. The deliberate demolition of the colossal Buddhas of Bamiyan in 2001 was an act of the same profound understanding. The Taliban recognized that those immense figures were not inert rock. They were active symbols of a faith and a history they sought to erase. To destroy the statue was to unlock and incinerate the story it held. Iconoclasm, therefore, is the darkest possible complement to the sculptor's art. It proves that the enemy understood the statue's true nature perfectly. They knew it was a living symbol, and so they did not ignore it, they killed it. Sometimes the most important words were never meant to be read by human eyes. Carved on the underside of a statue's base or hidden deep within a sealed cavity in its chest, a second, secret text often waited in total darkness. These were not the public proclamations of hieroglyphs on an obelisk, meant to proclaim a pharaoh's glory to the world. These cryptic inscriptions were the protected core of the statue's power, the esoteric knowledge intended only for the gods themselves or the handful of high priests who held the keys. To understand them, you must first understand that ancient knowledge was not considered a single public commodity. It was layered like an onion. The outer layer was the story for the people, the myth carved in clear symbols for all to see. But the inner layers contained truths so potent that to handle them carelessly was dangerous. This is where the art of the cryptographic hieroglyph was born. Scribes developed a secret script, replacing common signs with fantastical, composite creatures and abstract patterns. A dangerous deity's true name might be written not with standard characters, but with a complex cipher of intertwined serpents and scepters, a code designed to contain its volatile power while still allowing its invocation by those trained in the art. The statue, therefore, became a kind of metaphysical safe. Its public form told one story, but its hidden texts held the real combination, the precise instructions and true names that activated its deeper function. Deciphering these messages today is a task that goes far beyond simple translation. It requires an immersion into a mystical world, where a word was not just a label, but a fragment of the thing itself. To read the secret name of a god was to risk summoning its attention. This layered approach transformed every statue into a potential mystery. The smiling goddess in the temple courtyard offered comfort to the farmer, but beneath her stone sandals, a text known only to the priesthood might describe the terrifying chaos she subdued at the dawn of time. One story for stability and order, another for the raw, creative power that made that order possible. The statue held both in perfect, silent balance, a testament to the ancient belief that true wisdom must always be protected, hidden in plain sight until the right mind is ready to unlock it. You feel your own smallness first. The architects of Karnak and the carvers of the Lungmen grottos understood this primal sensation intimately. They wielded scale itself as a psychological weapon, crafting monuments so immense they physically diminished every person who stood before them. This was not an accident of grandiosity. It was a deliberate calculation. To stand in the shadow of a 60-foot pharaoh was to receive a silent, crushing lecture on your place in the universe. You were a fleeting mortal, and this stone being represented a power that was eternal and absolute. That overwhelming awe was the intended gateway to devotion, but it was a gateway flanked by the twin pillars of reverence and fear. The same colossal figure that promised cosmic order could also imply a terrible, crushing wrath for those who strayed. This carefully managed emotional spectrum was the bedrock of social control. The story of divine power was not just told by the symbols on the statue, it was felt in the pit of your stomach. Yet for the private sphere, the emotional calculus was entirely different. The small terracotta statue of a household god, smoothed by generations of anxious hands, was designed for intimacy, not intimidation. Its story was one of personal guardianship, a familiar face in the uncertain dark. You could whisper your fears to this figure and act unthinkable before the cold, distant giant in the state temple. The material itself reinforced this emotional contract. A household god might be simple, affordable clay, something that felt accessible and human. The state god, in contrast, was forged from cold, priceless obsidian or gleaming gold, substances meant to feel alien and utterly separate from the mundane world. Every choice, from the stone's sheen to the statue's inaccessible location on a high altar, was a lever to pull a specific emotional string within the viewer. The locked story was not a dry text to be decoded. It was a script for a profound psychological experience, an emotional journey that began the moment you laid eyes on the stone and felt your own heart respond. That same profound intuition, the belief in a living image, pulsed through civilizations that never exchanged a single word. In the temples of India, priests perform a ceremony called prana pratishtha, the establishment of life force. It is a breathtaking parallel to the Egyptian opening of the mouth, conducted thousands of miles and centuries apart. Through chants, visualizations, and the final opening of the statue's eyes, the murti is transformed from a beautiful object into a seat for the divine, a living body for the god. It becomes so sacred that its gaze is considered potent, requiring careful management. Meanwhile, in the groves of ancient Greece, the most revered cult statues were not the polished marbles of later eras, but the zona. These were primitive, often featureless wooden figures, their forms so ancient and weathered they seemed to have no human craftsman. The legend was that they had simply fallen from the sky, direct gifts from the heavens, possessing an innate, untamed life of their own. This is the stunning cross-cultural truth. From the Nile to the Ganges to the Aegean, a universal pattern emerges. The methods of animation varied wildly, from the high theology of a priestly ritual to the raw belief in a God-given log. Yet the core idea remained unshakable. An image could be more than a reminder. It could be a residence. This parallel development, this shared spiritual technology, points to something deep within the human psyche. Locking a story into a statue was not just an artistic choice. It was answering a fundamental, almost desperate need to make the invisible tangible, to build a bridge across the chasm separating our world from the world of the gods. And this need to house a presence did not end at the temple door. It followed humanity into the silent, final frontier of the tomb, where the story locked in stone was meant to guide a soul through the ultimate transition. Deep within the sealed darkness of a tomb, a single statue stood waiting, its purpose far greater than remembrance. This was the Ka statue of an Egyptian noble, a perfect, indestructible double of his physical form. Its role was one of stark, practical necessity. The ancient Egyptians believed a person's soul was a composite of several parts, and the ka was the vital life force that needed a permanent home. The mummified body was the primary residence, but what if it decayed, was robbed, or destroyed? The ka statue was the ultimate backup, a guaranteed vessel carved from the hardest granite to endure for eternity. It was a piece of functional afterlife insurance, its serene face and idealized body holding the complete story of the individual's identity. The hieroglyphs on its base were not a eulogy, they were a passport listing the person's names, their titles, and their righteous deeds, all essential credentials to be presented to the gods of the underworld. Without this locked story of a well-lived life, the soul risked becoming a nameless, forgotten shadow, lost in the void. This profound need to preserve the self explains the incredible care taken with these funerary figures. They were often placed in a special, sealed chamber within the tomb called the serdab, with only a small slit in the wall, allowing the statue to magically witness the offerings and rituals performed in its honor. It was a direct line of sustenance from the world of the living to the eternity of the dead. But the journey to the afterlife was long and filled with dangers, a path no one was expected to walk alone. This belief in the necessity of a stone companion was a universal one, inspiring creations of staggering scale and ambition far beyond the banks of the Nile. In China, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, took this concept to its logical, terrifying extreme. He was not buried with a single statue, but with an entire terracotta army, thousands of life-sized soldiers, chariots, and horses, each with unique facial features, standing in battle formation in vast underground pits. This was not a symbolic gesture. The story locked into this silent, subterranean legion was one of perpetual, unchallenged imperial power. The emperor's narrative of conquest and control did not end with his physical death. It was projected directly into the next world. These clay warriors were active participants, an eternal guard meant to serve, protect, and conquer for their master in the realm of the gods. They were the ultimate expression of a story so important, so central to a person's identity, that it had to be carved into an army and buried with him, ensuring his tale of dominance would continue uninterrupted forever. Yet a problem emerged for these new faiths. If God was a singular, all-powerful entity beyond space and time, how could any human hand carve a vessel large enough to contain him? The old logic of statues as divine houses became a theological impossibility, a blasphemous attempt to imprison the infinite within the finite. The divine story needed a new kind of container, one that could hold a transcendent truth without claiming to be its physical body. The answer was found not in stone but in ink. The focus of sacred power shifted decisively from the three-dimensional statue to the two-dimensional page. The Torah scroll, the Bible, the Quran, these were not merely books of instruction. They became the new living vessels. The word itself, carefully inscribed, was now the primary vehicle for the divine presence. A single, beautifully illuminated letter in a medieval manuscript was not just a mark. It was a sacred artifact charged with the same reverence once reserved for a cult statue's eyes. The story was no longer locked in a form you could walk around, but in a text you could recite, a rhythm of syllables that itself was believed to hold power. This was not the end of the symbolic impulse, however. It was a migration. In the soaring domes of Byzantine churches, the glittering mosaics of Christ and the saints were not considered idols. They were windows into heaven, authorized portraits that made the invisible spiritual world accessible to the faithful. The veneration shown to an icon was a complex dance of theology, a honor paid to the prototype represented, not the wood and paint itself. The ancient need to see the divine story had found a new, carefully regulated outlet. The lock had changed, but the human desire to peer inside remained as strong as ever. The true cost of a living god was staggering. To craft the cult statue of Athena Parthenos, the city of Athens did not simply spend money. It transformed its entire economy into a devotional act. The state treasury, filled with silver from the mines at Laurion and tribute from a sprawling maritime alliance, was physically housed within the Parthenon itself, in the very chamber that sheltered the goddess. Every silver coin, every bar of precious metal, was understood as an extension of her divine wealth, a sacred trust to be used in her service. This was not an expense, it was the city's most vital investment. Consider the sheer manpower required. Hundreds of the most skilled individuals in the ancient world were employed for years. Miners risked their lives for the marble and silver. Quarrymen mastered the art of extracting colossal blocks without fracturing them. Master sculptors, bronze workers, ivory carvers, and goldsmiths all applied their lifetime of training to a single, transcendent project. The statue was the apex of a vast economic pyramid, supporting entire industries and feeding countless families. This immense investment told a powerful social story to both citizens and rivals. It declared that Athens was not merely rich, it was pious, sophisticated, and utterly confident in its divine patron. The statue was a civic anchor, a source of collective pride so potent that its creation bound the community together in a shared, monumental purpose. To pour such resources into a single figure was to make a tangible, unshakable wager on the reality of the divine relationship. You were not just carving a symbol, you were financing a permanent, physical connection to the source of all order and prosperity. This profound value, however, carried a terrible risk. The very materials that made the statue a fitting vessel for a god, the tons of gold and ivory, also made it the ultimate prize for any conqueror or looter. The community's greatest act of faith became its most vulnerable treasure, a paradox the ancients understood all too well. An empty plinth in a modern museum is a monument to a severed connection. These blank spaces, like the one in Athens meant for a caryatid now housed in London, speak of a story violently interrupted. The debate over artifacts like the Elgin marbles is not merely about legal ownership, it is a battle over narrative sovereignty. To physically loot a statue is to perform a brutal act of unlocking. The story is not erased, but it is brutally wrenched from its native soil and forced to serve a foreign plot. Consider a classical Greek statue, perhaps of a goddess, pried from its temple and transported to a wealthy Roman's country villa. In its new home, it was no longer a sacred vessel for a divine presence. Its story was rewritten from one of communal faith to one of private conquest and refined aesthetic taste, a trophy of imperial power. The statue's form remained, but its soul was hollowed out. This pattern repeats with tragic consistency across centuries. The magnificent Benin bronzes, intricate metal plaques and sculptures that documented the history and courtly life of the West African Kingdom of Benin were violently looted by British forces in 1897. Displayed in European and American museums, they were presented as primitive art, their sophisticated craftsmanship admired while their original function as a historical record of a powerful and complex civilization was systematically obscured. The new story they were forced to tell was one of colonial supremacy, a justification for the very violence that uprooted them. The statue becomes a prisoner in a glass case, its true voice silenced, its encoded narrative twisted to serve its captor's history. This modern form of loss reveals a profound truth the ancients understood instinctively, that the physical connection between a statue and its place of origin is not a minor detail, it is an essential chapter of the locked story itself. The sacred geography, the alignment with a temple or a mountain, the community that knew its rituals, these are the context that gives the symbols their meaning and the form its power. To sever that connection is to rip a single page from a vast, interconnected book, leaving behind a mystery that can never be fully solved. The ancient impulse to carve meaning into stone did not vanish with the last pagan temple. It simply found new forms, channeling the same human need to make our stories permanent. Our modern monuments are the direct descendants of those sacred vessels, built to house the spirits of ideas rather than gods. The Statue of Liberty is not a goddess in the classical sense, yet she holds a profound story within her copper form, a narrative of enlightenment and welcome for generations of immigrants seeing her torch as a first glimpse of a new world. Her raised light and broken chains are a modern symbolic language, as deliberate and coded as the crook and flail of an Egyptian pharaoh. She was designed to be a permanent argument for liberty, a story locked in metal to withstand the shifting tides of politics. Another American landmark, Mount Rushmore, carves a far more controversial narrative directly into the living rock of the Black Hills. Its colossal presidential faces tell a story of national expansion and foundational legacy, a version of history that for many erases a deeper, older story of the land itself. The monument is a powerful, unyielding assertion of one narrative, demonstrating how this ancient technique can be used to cement a single perspective for centuries. Our war memorials, with their rows of silent, bronze soldiers or their stark, black granite walls, are perhaps the closest we come to the old magic. These figures are vessels for our collective grief, pride, and memory. We do not believe a fallen soldier's soul inhabits the statue, yet we still gather before it, leaving flowers and tokens as if it were a living presence. We imbue it with our emotions, making it a focal point for a national story of sacrifice and identity. This is the evolved legacy of the living symbol. We may have stopped performing the opening of the mouth ceremony, but we have never stopped breathing life into our monuments. They remain our most durable attempts to speak to the future, to carve our values into the landscape, and to create anchors for our collective consciousness. The materials and the gods have changed, but the desperate, beautiful battle against oblivion continues with every monument we raise. A tiny brush whisks away a millennium of dust from a stone lip, and in that quiet gesture, a modern kind of magic unfolds. This is archaeology, the secular priesthood of our age, and its sacred duty is to listen. We are the new initiates standing before these silent forms and desperately trying to relearn a language we have forgotten. Our rituals are not of incense and chant, but of comparative mythology and material science. We use X-ray fluorescence to identify the specific quarry of a marble block, tracing the statue's origin story through its atomic signature. We employ laser scanning to detect the faintest traces of pigment, restoring the vibrant colors that once made a god seem terrifyingly alive. Each of these techniques is a step toward reanimation, an attempt to recharge the symbolic battery and hear the whisper of the story locked inside. The breakthrough that echoes through history was, of course, the Rosetta Stone. That single slab of black granodiorite did not merely give us a translation of hieroglyphs. It handed us the master key to an entire library of stone, allowing the statues of Egypt to finally speak their names and their purposes after 1400 years of silence. Suddenly, the rigid figure of a pharaoh was no longer just a generic king. He was Pepi II or Hatshepsut, his individual biography now legible in the carvings that surrounded him. Modern tools continue this revelation. A CT scan of a medieval wooden Madonna might reveal a sealed cavity in her back, holding a parchment scroll with a prayer written by the long-dead sculptor, a secret message meant only for the divine. This is not just finding an object, it is recovering a relationship. It is the difference between seeing a lonely, broken column in a field and understanding that it was once part of a temple designed to align with the rising sun on the solstice, its shadow falling precisely on an altar where a community gathered to reaffirm its bond with the cosmos. Archaeology at its best does not just put artifacts in glass cases. It strives to put them back into the world to restore the context that gives them meaning. This painstaking scientific process is our civilization's answer to the ancient fear of oblivion. We are now the ones brushing the dust from the stone, not to build a new world upon it, but to finally understand why its story was considered so precious, so vital, that it had to be carved for eternity. This desperate need to carve our name into the universe speaks to a fear as old as consciousness itself. We are temporary beings in a world that forgets, and the ancients felt this fragility with a sharpness we can barely grasp. Their entire reality was built on cycles of decay, empires dissolving into dust, languages fading into silence, and the oral tales of grandparents lost within a generation. In the face of this relentless erosion, stone was their one reliable ally. It was a material that could withstand the weather of centuries and the forgetfulness of men. To lock a story into a statue was to perform an act of pure defiance against the void. It was a shout cast forward into the deafening silence of the future, a message in a bottle meant for shores they would never see. The impulse was not merely artistic or religious, it was existential. By creating a durable vessel for their most vital truths, they were attempting to cheat time itself, to grant their culture a kind of immortality that their own mortal bodies could never possess. Think of the immense labor required to quarry a single obelisk or to cast a colossal bronze. That was not just piety, it was a monumental wager on memory. They were betting that the stone would last longer than the empire, that the symbol would outlive the language, that the god's face would still be recognized long after the names of the carvers had vanished. Every statue, from the smallest household guardian to the most colossal pharaoh, was a stake driven deep into the flowing river of time. Its silent presence was a declaration to any future age, a permanent record etched in the most permanent ink they could find. We were here, it says, we loved, we feared, we worshipped, and this is what we believed mattered enough to last forever. This deep-seated human yearning to be remembered, to leave a mark that outlasts our own fleeting breath, is the ultimate key. It unlocks the reason why they poured their greatest wealth and finest skill into these silent forms, entrusting their souls to the patient, unblinking memory of stone. Our journey through these silent stone witnesses leaves us with a profound truth. These statues were not inert art, they were the most sophisticated hard drives their creators could build, designed to store the very soul of a civilization. We have walked through their many functions, seeing them as divine vessels housing a conscious presence, as public memory palaces preserving epic tales, as political tools broadcasting unshakable power, and as magical protectors warding off invisible threats. Each of these principles adds another layer to our understanding, revealing a world view where matter and spirit were inseparable partners. The stories locked inside were not passive data. They were programs activated by ritual, amplified by sacred location, and decoded through a universal language of symbols, transforming them into living forces that actively shaped the reality of those who believed. The specific gods may have fallen silent, their rituals forgotten, but the core human impulse remains as strong as ever. We still raise monuments to make our abstract values tangible, to carve our collective identity into the landscape, and to send a message to the future. So the next time you find yourself standing before an ancient statue, pause for a moment, look past the weathered stone and the museum label, see it for what it truly was, a locked door. And if you listen closely, in the silence, you might just hear the faint, persistent whisper of a forgotten world, urging us to remember. If these mysteries of our past captivate you, subscribe for more deep dives into the secrets hidden in plain sight. And we would love to hear from you. Which ancient symbol or statue fascinates you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below.